Ladies and gentlemen, we are back with a brand new season. I know I've been excited and now we've finally gotten our hands on it. So the question now remains, is this enough to save Apex Legends? And right off the bat, I think the answer is a little bit more complicated than just yes or no. But I do think that this is a step in the right direction. One of the biggest issues over the last couple seasons is that the game has felt a bit samey. Sure, we got a new legend in Alter and we've seen some changes with the way that the Battle Royale works. We've even had a few new LTMs and concepts that they hadn't quite explored before. But this is the first time in a long time that it really feels like we're getting something new. And even though there's not a new weapon, we do have the akimbo system, something that a lot of us have wanted for a long time, so I'm sure many players are happy to finally have it. But the fact of the matter is Apex currently has a lot of competition, and bringing the game back is not just about keeping the players that are already playing happy, it's also about figuring out ways to bring in new players and keep those new players once they come in. I do think that this season has a lot of things that are good for both new and returning players, but I also think that there are some areas where this season might be taking some missteps that could harm the game in the long run. So what I want to do for this video is to break it into 3 sections: the good, the bad, and the ugly. I'm not going to cover every single change that was brought in this patch because it was a long patch, but I do want to talk about a couple of things in each category that move the needle in one direction or the other. And I want to start with the good, because as much as we give Respawn and EA crap for the things that they do wrong, I do think it's important for us to give them their flowers when they do something right. And in my opinion, this season has done a lot of things right. First of all, the map, E-District, is beautiful. It's different. It uses assets that we've not seen used in the game before. And yes, we've had cities. We had Capital City, we then had Fragments, and of course we've always had Skyhook that everybody for some reason sleeps on. But this is the first time that a city has felt like a real place. When you're walking between the buildings, you feel like you're in a cramped alleyway. And the buildings themselves have a sense of scale that previous locations have never had. There are numerous different types of terrain and choke points and different types of battles that you can have because of how varied the layouts of the different areas of the city are. And despite the fact that there's a lot going on, they've somehow also been able to make most of the POIs feel very unique and interesting on their own. I don't think that makes the map perfect. I do think there are issues with the size and the loot distribution, which I may touch on later on. But for the most part, I think that players are going to be really happy to experience this map and that there's enough depth here to keep us continually learning more about how to play on it over the coming months. The second positive addition to this season is the change to the controller legends. Most of us know that the controller legends have been out of favor for a really long time. Even when they've been popular in ALGS or in the ranked meta, nobody in pubs wants to play the person that has to sit in one location. And while I do think that that feeling is part of the core nature of Apex Legends, I think that what they've done this season is a great way to incentivize people to play these characters. Getting 25 extra shields while you're in the circle is just a net benefit for the class. And on top of that, it encourages you to play the characters in the way that they're designed to play. I would argue that maps like E-District and Stormpoint are also really good for these legends because there are lots of locations that you can bunker down in once you get to circle. And you could argue the same for Broken Moon to a lesser extent. And this isn't including the changes that they've made to characters like Watson with her new abilities, and also the fact that they can all pick up their tacticals from a distance now. I don't know if this is enough to make the controller legends match the pick rate of a character like Octane, but I do think it's enough to make people start moving in that direction. Another change that I think is going to really bring a lot of life to the season is the fact that they've nerfed aim assist. And if we're being realistic, it's not lowered enough that people at the top level will feel it that much. But even just the fact that they're willing to investigate this kind of solution at all is a sign that the game is moving in the right direction. I know mouse and keyboard players get a lot of flack for this from controller players, but at this point, with most of the pro meta switching over to controller, it's getting really hard to argue that there's not an inherent advantage in the input. I mean, when you have 2 players that are around the exact same skill level, the aim is the same, the movement is the same, and the battle comes down to 1 or 2 shots, if one player perceives that the other has help in landing one of those 2 shots, it's going to feel bad. And it doesn't matter whether aim assist actually had an impact on the fight or not, just the idea that it could have influenced the fight feels bad psychologically. So I think that addressing the aim assist problem is a good thing for Respawn to do. Personally, I do feel that the inputs should just be separated, but I also realize that Respawn has access to a lot more data than we do. So whether it's that the infrastructure won't allow for the separation of inputs, or if they discovered early on that the player base of mouse and keyboard players isn't large enough to support their own lobbies, the fact remains that Respawn has chosen not to do that. So if they're not going to separate the inputs, I think that this is probably the best way to handle it. And this change will also help PC players when paired with the next one, which is that they've removed the aim flinch when you take damage. This is something that you might not have immediately recognized, but you've probably felt at some point throughout the update that something feels a bit off. Almost like you're killing your enemies faster, or in some cases they're killing you faster. And the reason why it feels that way is because normally when you're taking damage and when your opponent is taking damage, aim flinch happens, which moves your gun off target and forces you to miss more shots. Now, because aim flinch is gone, when you take those shots, as long as your recoil control is on point, you're going to land more shots. And because you're not missing as much as you were previously, you're going to down your enemies faster. But the opposite is also true in that if your enemy has better aim than you, they'll down you faster. I'm really happy with this change because in a game like Apex Legends where skill is so important to every battle, having something random like aim flinch steal a victory from you just feels wrong. If you have good aim, you should hit your shots. And now you will. And finally, before we move on to the bad, there's one more thing that I want to highlight from this season, and that is the change to crypto. Some of you might not be aware of this, but the name and concept for crypto's off-the-grid passive is actually something that's been floating around the community for a long time. And to be honest, I never thought that it would actually get done. Especially because Mirage at one point was invisible and they took that feature away. The fact that they've implemented this change for crypto is something that we should be happy about because it means that in spite of everything that we complain about, the devs actually are listening to us. And sometimes they give us what we ask for. So if for no other reason, this falls into the good category because it gives us hope for what the game could be in the future. But wherever there is good, there is also bad. And I'm using this as kind of like the mid area where things may not be something that I'm happy with, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to kill the game or harm the game in any way. It's just something that I personally wish was different. So the first thing that falls into this category for me is the fact that Duos has still not returned. Now there was a glitch at launch where some people were actually able to get into a couple of Duos games. So there's no doubt in my mind that it's coming back at some point. And I know not everybody cares about Duos. Some people are ridiculous with it and go out of their way to insult anybody that asks for Duos back. Is this what solo players felt like all those years that they were being told to shut up? Personally, ever since the majority of my friends stopped playing this game, Duos is my preferred way to play. One, because there are times where I can't get more than one of my friends online in order to join me for a lobby. So it is nice to be able to play with them and have our team synergy without having to worry about a random third person. But I also like Duos because of the fact that it's way easier to deal with one bad teammate than two bad teammates. I think we can all agree that dealing with one extra opponent is way easier than dealing with two extra opponents when your teammates aren't carrying their weight. Or when the game just decides to not give you teammates, as it does to me literally all the time. But this also leads into the second bad thing about this season, which is that matchmaking has once again not really been addressed. And I know every time this gets brought up, there's somebody that goes, oh, a skill issue. Well, yeah, duh. If there was no such thing as skill-based matchmaking in Apex Legends, I wouldn't be complaining about this because in random matchmaking, I would expect that some of my lobbies are just gonna be a little bit unfair. But since Respawn has gone out of their way to double down on skill-based matchmaking time after time, I expect that matchmaking system to work. I am not a Masters or Predator player. I don't have any delusions about my own skill level. I'm still working to improve, but at the same time, I recognize that there's a huge difference between me and a Pred player. So if the skill-based matchmaking system is putting me up against not just one, but multiple Predator and Masters teams, it means that the system does not work. And in my opinion, it should work. But the reason this is only in the bad category is that this is just part of Apex at this point, and we've all decided to just play the game despite fight it. It's annoying, but it can't be helped. But the last thing that I'm gonna put in this bad category, at least for now, is the recon perk that highlights enemies in line of sight. And the main reason for this is just that it feels unnecessary. You're already coloring all of the legends in this red outline. The idea that you also for some reason need to fill in that red outline for recon legends is a bit silly. I'm sure that for some people this might come in handy, but for the most part, it's really not gonna do that much, especially because it doesn't work through smoke. Not saying that it should, but it really just feels like an unnecessary addition. But note that I say unnecessary and not terrible, because at the end of the day, I honestly don't think this is gonna change that much considering the fact that we all have red outlines around us to our enemies. But the one thing that I do feel like is a very slippery slope, and the one thing that I am putting in the ugly category, is the new battle sense perk that everyone gets. The idea that when you shoot your enemy, you can now see their health bar. This is a very, very dangerous ability to have added to Apex Legends. And I want to start before I get too deep into it talking about it from a slightly different perspective, because I can see what the developers were thinking when they created this ability. One of the biggest issues in Apex Legends, and one of the things the developers have always said that they want to prioritize for this game, is combat legibility. It's the reason why we don't have double jumps and the reason why we don't have wall running, despite the fact that this game is sort of a successor to Titanfall. Information in a battle royale is power, and they want that information to be as clear as possible. Why, in that case, have footsteps remained a problem since the beginning of the game? I don't know, but let's not talk about that right now. Instead, let's focus on the idea behind this battle sense perk. When you shoot an enemy, you can now see their health, which means that if you crack an enemy but don't actually do that much damage to their health, then you should be aware of it, and that way you won't make an unnecessarily aggressive push. On the flip side, if you do a lot of damage to your enemy and you have more health than them, now you can make the educated decision to take that risk. And on the surface, this sounds like a good idea. It's great for new players because they get the opportunity to understand what's happening when they're in a fight, and it's great for experienced players because they can be confident enough in their own abilities to know whether or not a fight should be taken. But the one issue that I do have with this change is that it removes an element of risk-taking that makes this game fun and interesting. In a recent coaching session from No Cocoa Puffs, he talked about the first thing that you should do after you win a fight, and his advice was that after you win, one of your teammates should immediately go to a vantage point where they can look for the third party. Now this includes even if they've only popped a battery and not healed their health, because putting pressure on your approaching enemies, despite the fact that your team may not be fully reset, will make them pause and think about whether or not they should still push. And that little bit of hesitation that you can cause can buy your team the time that they need. The best thing you can do in a battle royale where you only have one life is take unfair fights. But the beauty of Apex Legends up until now is that in some cases there was no way to know whether or not the fight was fair. This new system, in seeking to give the players more clarity about the state of the battle, is removing an area that allowed players to express their skill by bluffing. And personally, I see that as a bad thing. But I think even more, it begs the question of what do we as the player base want Apex Legends to be? Because as much as I don't like this change, it does make the game much easier to jump into. Because while we as experienced players can appreciate that bluff, for a new player getting involved, it can feel cheap to lose to an opponent that you could have killed if you had just known how much health they had. And I'm not saying this to defend this new system, but I am saying that maybe Respawn is considering the new player. The question that we need to ask ourselves as long-time and experienced players is, if we want this game to keep growing, and if we want this to be something that EA continues to support for the foreseeable future, and if we don't want the servers to be shut down because nobody but the dedicated few are still playing the game, are we willing to concede some of these things that take away from the core of the game if it means that Apex is going to last a lot longer? And personally, I don't know if I have an answer to that question, because maybe it's changes like this that change the core nature of Apex to be a little bit easier that will save the game. Not that Apex is necessarily dying, but it's hard to argue that the community gets smaller and smaller with every passing year, and as the community gets smaller, the game gets sweatier and it's even harder for new players to jump in. So that's my question to you guys. Is it worth it to make the game easier if it means the game will live longer? Or do you think it's the right thing for Apex to stick to its roots? If you forced me to pick a side, I would say stick to your roots, but also create exciting things that bring new players into the game, and at the same time, create tools that allow those new players to get to a point where they can compete. Some people might argue that the bot lobbies are a solution for that, but eventually these players are going to want to fight against real people. So while I don't agree with the health bars, I do understand Respawn's perspective of wanting to make the game easier for those players once they transition into real matches. But like I said, I don't have all the answers, and I don't think any one person will. So again, let me know in the comment section what you think about this, and let me know what you're feeling about this season. I'm really having a good time so far, but I'm curious what the rest of the community is feeling. Also remember to like and subscribe if you enjoyed this video, and I will see you in the next one. Thanks for watching.